The Middle East holds its breath tonight as Israel weighs its response to Iran's attack over the weekend. Most of the hundreds of Iranian missiles and drones were intercepted with the help of the US, the UK, France and Jordan. A potentially small price for Israel flattening a consulate in Damascus and killing an Iranian general. Despite claims of minimal damage and suggestions from the US that Israel take the win, retaliation is expected. Allies opposing any further action, arguing for peace instead.
We are working urgently with our allies to de-escalate the situation and prevent further bloodshed. We want to see calmer heads prevail, and we are directing all our diplomatic efforts to that end. I will also shortly be speaking to Prime Minister Netanyahu to express our solidarity with Israel in the face of this attack and to discuss how we can prevent further escalation. All sides must show restraint.
The Israeli military is already fighting to the west in Gaza, to the north against Hezbollah, and now defending against Iranian missiles to the east. The fear is that any more tit-for-tat exchanges could escalate into something far, far bigger at the worst possible moment. The government says it's backing Israel, but how far will it go? Here for more is Conservative MP for Foreign Affairs Committee member Bob Seely. Bob, thank you so much for joining us here on Prime Time. The situation, of course, is serious. Israel will want to respond. I'm assuming that our government says, lay off, let's leave it be.
James, hi. Good evening to your viewers and listeners. Look, this is not the end of this war. What we're hoping is that it's the end of this phase on it, because you've had a direct attack from one state on another. And actually, I think it was designed to be effective. I don't buy that actually it was all for show, but we can talk about that. I think what we're keen to do is to minimize an immediate escalation. Where we're going to be in 6 months or a year's time is another matter. I would just say there is a lot of circumstantial evidence that the Russians and the Iranians are talking about strategies for missile launches, and they're clearly trying to learn off each other.
What's very clear from this is that the Iranian munitions effective at being launched, not effective at reaching their targets. Does it mean that we should take them seriously?
That is, I get what your point is, and you're not wrong for saying it, but I strongly disagree. If you look at what the Iranians were doing, they were mimicking the Russian policy that you send slower Shahed drones to confuse your air defense systems, and then the faster ballistic missiles go through and do major damage. So what they were trying to do was a Russian tactic, because that's what the Russians are doing to overwhelm the Ukrainian defenses. They were trying to do a Russian tactic against Israel. Now, because Israel's defense is so much more complex, 3 layers, you've got the arrow and the David sling, I think, and then you've got the Iron Dome, which is only the last bit of that defense. The Israeli systems are much more sophisticated than the Ukrainian systems, but the Iranians were trying the same tactics. So actually they were designed to hit. And the fact is, next time, they may be more successful. And the other thing I would add to that is that Hezbollah have thousands upon thousands of missiles, and there is a greater probability that they could overwhelm Israeli defenses, because the Israeli radar and the missile systems will just simply run out of the ability to shoot down everything.
OK, so Israel has warned about the threat of Iran for many years now. We in the West have tried to de-escalate. We've tried to perhaps negotiate, to pacify, to stop these kinds of wars. All that seems to have allowed to happen is that huge amounts of munitions are built up. The Iranians clearly have the capability, as you say, and you talk about what they're trying to achieve. So were the Israelis right all the time? Is Israel right in its assertion that Iran is a real threat and needs to be neutered?
It is a real threat. You don't necessarily neutralize a threat by bombing it, by starting a war with it, because that could make it stronger, even if it survives. So it depends which bit of that threat you're talking about. We know that Iran's a threat. Iran has also been running all its proxies. And, you know, if you're ex-British Army like I am, you're used to having Iranian missiles flying into the Basra air base when we were based down in southern Iraq. Excuse me. So we know they're a threat. We know their proxies attack people. We know their proxies are trying to attack people in the United Kingdom as well. But actually, our major players in the Middle East, be it the Hamas, be it Hezbollah, be it the Houthis, be it various sectarian groups within Iraq. So yes, they are absolutely a threat. The issue is, how do you deal with that threat?
When somebody who has former experience in an area calls this not Britain's war, not Britain's fight, we shouldn't be getting involved, how should we respond to those who say that we shouldn't be involved, we shouldn't be shooting down, whether it's drones or munitions?
Okay, James, remind me who said that?
So that was said by the former Iranian ambassador, who I believe was the ambassador between 2006 and 2010.
Well, I'm sure if you give me enough time, I can find someone in the Foreign Office, or I can find plenty of experts who say something else. We're having a debate about this. One ex-diplomat is not necessarily the font of wisdom, although I'm sure they're very knowledgeable, and I would take seriously what that person said. This is not our war to the extent that we're not going to be fighting this for Israel, and actually Israel is much more capable of doing so. But I do think helping to shoot down missiles which are fired at Israel from Iran, I think, is good for us, because I think it is ethically the right thing to do. But I also think it increases our leverage potentially over Israel, and working with the French and working with the Americans to try to keep peace, and also with the Saudis and with the Jordanians, because you have an anti-Iranian coalition here that is absolutely in our interest to be part of, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because then we have a say, and we have a greater say than what happens than if we're saying, oh, we're not going to trade arms with you, or we're not going to share intelligence with you, and we're going to go and sulk somewhere in the corner, because that means we have zero influence. We also have zero access to the intelligence as well. So actually, I think what we're doing is the right thing. I want us to be engaged. I don't want us to give us carte blanche to Israel to do what it wants. And it doesn't excuse some of the bad things that have been happening in Gaza, and the issue of there's two issues of warfare, James. There's military necessity, which is absolutely within Israel's right, but there's also humanity and proportionality, and clearly there's a growing acceptance that they're getting that wrong, which they are.
So let me just ask you finally, if I may, just in terms of getting British support for this, because I'm very concerned that there are a lot of people in this country who live in our country who do not support the government, or indeed the opposition's view that Israel is an ally. They do not support that view that we should stand by Israel in this fight, in this war, and they do not support Israeli actions. How on earth do we win that, if you like, war at home, when, of course, you've explained so clearly why this is important internationally for us to support them?
Thanks, James. I mean, for that case, I think actually the amount of people who are opposed to Israel badly in this country, or significantly, I think is relatively small. And just because they dominate the media, I think people in the media think that the media is often representative of real life. And I would respectfully say that it is sometimes, but not always. And loud, noisy protesters does not make a base of substantive support. I think people have great sympathy with what has happened in Israel after the despicable Hamas attack, but people also, their hearts go out to what is happening in Gaza. What we have to do is get the Israelis to be more proportionate, whilst recognizing that they have a right to exist. And what we also have to do is make sure that we're part of an anti-Iranian coalition to do what we can against the Iranian regime, because they are a massive destabilizing force. And critically on that point, as many Iranian experts, James, will say, the Iranian regime and the Iranian people are absolutely not the same, as we see from the very consistent attempts by the Iranian regime to put down their own people time and time again, over wearing of a headdress and other things, of the oppression of women, of the oppression of people who want free elections and free choice in that country and want a greater sense of freedom. Iran is a hugely old and very sophisticated country, potentially should have been, like Russia, except for the Bolsheviks, our natural allies. And what the Iranian regime has done has been a tragedy, above all, to the people of that country. So we absolutely have to be reaching out to the people, whilst doing what we can to harm the interests of the IRGC, which is a repugnant force and a destabilizing force in that part of the world.
Bob Seeley, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening and giving us your insight and take on matters.